Welcome to our deep dive, and today we're going to be looking at what we could call Canada's immigration conundrum.
Okay.
You've given us some really interesting material here to dig into, and it seems that Canada, a country famous for being so welcoming to immigrants,
Hmm.
well, they're kind of at a crossroads right now.
Right.
We've got these record-breaking immigration levels happening at the same time as a housing crisis, and all this is happening as public opinion on immigration is changing pretty drastically.
Hmm.
So we'll be exploring all of that today, how Canada got to this point, what the main issues are, and what it all means, for everyday Canadians.
Hmm.
So to kick things off,
Hmm.
I think it's important to remember that Canada's history with immigration is long and complicated.
Oh, absolutely.
Like back in the 1800s,
Yeah.
they were really focused on westward expansion.
Yeah.
There was this big push to get people to settle the prairies.
Yeah.
There were all these slogans like build your nest in Western Canada.
Hmm.
They even called it the new El Dorado. And they really needed farmers, to settle all that land.
Right.
But some of the historical quotes you shared really reveal another side to this.
Yeah.
They talk about wanting to keep Canada a white man's country. And it's kind of a stark reminder of how much values and priorities can change over time.
Yeah, it's true. That historical context is really important. But I think to really understand Canada's approach to immigration today, we have to recognize how much it's evolved. By the mid-20th century, Canada had already shifted to a points-based immigration system.
Oh, wow.
It's actually the oldest system of its kind in the entire OECD, and that shows a really long-standing commitment to immigration. But not just any immigration. This point system actually evaluates potential immigrants based on a whole range of factors,
Yeah.
things like their education level, their skills, language ability, and even their age.
Interesting.
And the goal was, and still is, to select people who can really contribute to Canada's economy and its social fabric.
So it sounds like they weren't just looking for people to fill up the prairies anymore.
Exactly. It became much more targeted.
So how does this point system work in practice?
Well, it actually gives the Canadian government a lot of flexibility. They can respond quickly to global migration trends and adjust the points system to prioritize certain skills or professions at different times. It's a very dynamic system designed to adapt to changing needs.
That makes a lot of sense. And from what I've read, this system seemed to be working pretty well for a while.
Mhm.
Canada was attracting a lot of highly educated people from all over the world.
Huh?
And for the most part, they were integrating into society pretty successfully.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating. In the 2000s, even Donald Trump praised Canada's merit-based immigration system.
Wow.
That's really saying something. But as we all know, things started to shift in the 2010s. A whole new set of challenges emerged.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big ones was worker shortages.
Mm-hmm.
They were popping up in key sectors like construction and healthcare.
Right.
And then there was the aging population issue, which was becoming more and more pressing. Canada was facing this kind of double whammy of not enough workers and a growing number of retirees. I came across this quote from Sean Fraser, who was the immigration minister at the time, and he said, "It's simple to me. Canada needs more people."
I see.
So it seemed like they were really doubling down on immigration as the solution to all these problems. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's really crucial to understand just how serious the aging population issue is in Canada. Back in 1971, they had this very comfortable ratio of 7 working age people for every senior citizen.
Oh, wow.
By 2012, that had dropped to 4 to 1. And projections suggest that by 2036, it'll be just 2 workers for every retiree.
That's a huge shift.
It is. And you have to think about the strain that puts on the economy and things like social safety nets. Fewer people working means less tax revenue, and at the same time, there's more demand for healthcare and pensions. It's a recipe for economic trouble.
Yeah, it sounds like they were between a rock and a hard place.
Definitely.
Bring in more people to keep the economy going, but risk putting even more strain on the system. That's a tough balancing act. So in 2022, they announced this really ambitious immigration plan, right?
Mm.
The goal was to welcome almost 500,000 permanent residents every year by 2025. And they were primarily focused on economic migrants. On paper, it seemed like a logical response to the challenges they were facing. But do you think there were some unintended consequences of this plan?
Absolutely. While boosting the workforce, seems like a good idea in theory, there were a couple of major issues that I think they may have underestimated. First off, even before this new plan was announced, the immigration offices were already completely swamped. They had this massive backlog of 2 million resident applications.
Wow.
And second, even without this huge influx of new people, Canada was already struggling with a housing shortage.
So it sounds like they were kind of adding fuel to a fire that was already burning.
Yes, and that fire quickly spread to other areas of the economy. While Canada's overall economy seemed to be doing well, on paper it was largely driven by population growth.
Okay.
But if you look at per capita growth, which is a much better measure of individual well-being, the picture wasn't so rosy. And I think that's a key point here. More people doesn't automatically equal a better life for everyone. So this rapid influx of people, on top of things like a lack of investment in affordable housing and supply chain constraints, well, it created this kind of perfect storm for an affordability crisis.
And that crisis became pretty much impossible to ignore.
Yeah.
Rent was going through the roof, groceries were getting more and more expensive every day, and there were all these stories of people working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. I
Right.
remember seeing this news report about 25 students all crammed into a single basement apartment.
Oh, wow.
And the mayor actually confirmed that these kinds of situations were becoming more and more common.
It's important to remember, though, that these issues weren't just caused by immigration.
Right.
Canada already had underlying problems like the housing shortage we talked about. But this huge influx of people, well, it definitely made those problems a whole lot worse.
Kind of like pouring gasoline on a smoldering fire. And on top of all the permanent residents, the number of temporary residents, including international students, also doubled between 2022 and 2024.
Oh, wow.
They reached 2.8 million people,
Mm-hmm.
which is a pretty significant chunk of the population, almost 7%, in fact.
Yeah.
Did this influx of temporary residents also contribute to the strain on housing and resources?
Absolutely. The increase in temporary residents, especially international students, added this whole other layer of complexity to the situation.
Okay.
While they definitely contribute to the economy and bring all sorts of diverse perspectives, their presence also puts pressure on things like housing and social services.
So we've got this sort of economic paradox and the overall economy is growing, but individual people aren't really feeling the benefits.
Right.
It seems like a recipe for discontent.
Mm.
Did this start to affect public opinion on immigration?
Oh, it absolutely did. Public sentiment, which had been really positive towards immigration just a few years before, started to shift pretty dramatically.
Yeah.
By 2024, polls were showing that more than half of Canadians actually felt that there was just too much immigration.
Wow.
There were even protests against mass immigration, which is something you almost never see in Canada.
That's a big deal. Canada has this image of itself as being so welcoming and inclusive.
It does.
This shift in public opinion suggests that the strain on the system was really starting to affect the social fabric of the country.
I think so.
And of course, all of this was happening at the same time that Trudeau's approval ratings were going down.
Yeah.
He was getting a lot of criticism for his handling of the immigration situation.
Yeah.
How did he respond to all this pressure?
Well, facing an upcoming election and with this growing sense of unease among the public, Trudeau had to do something. And so in a kind of surprising move, he actually admitted that we didn't get the balance quite right and announced that they were going to change course.
Oh,
He decided to reduce immigration targets in an effort to slow down population growth. The idea was to give the government some time to catch up on things like housing and infrastructure.
that was a pretty big admission, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Especially for a leader who had been such a strong supporter of high immigration levels.
It was, and I think it suggests that he was starting to realize just how serious the problem had become.
Do you think this course correction actually addressed the root causes of the problem, though?
That's a really great question. While reducing immigration might take some of the immediate pressure off, it doesn't really solve the underlying issues that created this situation in the first place.
Like what?
Well, for example, Canada has a long history of underinvesting in affordable housing. And that's not something that can be fixed overnight.
Right, it takes time.
It does. What's really interesting here is that I think this whole situation exposed this disconnect between the government's focus on macro-level economic indicators and the lived experiences of a lot of Canadians.
Right.
So while GDP might have been growing, the quality of life for a significant portion of the population was actually declining.
Right. And that can lead to some real problems.
It can. It's a recipe for social unrest.
It sounds like they were so focused on winning this global talent race that they kind of forgot about the people who were already living in the house, so to speak.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that.
This situation also raises some questions about the long-term sustainability of using immigration as the main driver of economic growth.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not managed carefully, it can lead to all sorts of unintended consequences like the ones we're seeing in Canada.
Absolutely.
I think this brings us to a really crucial point, the impact of all this on everyday Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
What are the real-world implications of this affordability crisis beyond just the numbers on a spreadsheet?
Well, for many Canadians, it means facing this reality where the basic things they need are becoming harder and harder to afford.
Right.
It means having less money at the end of the month and having to make tough choices.
Hmm.
And it also means feeling uncertain about the future, whether they'll be able to maintain their standard of living.
It's a reminder that economic growth doesn't always translate into a better life for everyone,
That's right.
and that if people are struggling just to make ends meet, it can create all sorts of social divisions and erode trust in institutions.
Yeah, I agree.
It's also interesting to think about how Canada's experience might offer some valuable lessons for other countries that are trying to figure out their own immigration policies.
I think that's a great point.
It shows that just opening the doors and saying, come on in, isn't enough.
Right.
You need to have the infrastructure, the resources, the support systems in place to make sure that newcomers can integrate and thrive.
Yeah,
Otherwise, you end up with a situation where everyone loses.
exactly.
But it's not just about practical things like housing and jobs.
Yeah.
It's also about managing public perception
Mhm.
and addressing those anxieties that people have about rapid demographic change.
Mhm.
Even in a country like Canada, which has always prided itself on being so welcoming to immigrants, there are limits to how much change a society can absorb without experiencing some friction.
I think that's a really important point. Yeah, you've touched on a really important point. This whole situation really challenges Canada's image as this welcoming and inclusive nation.
Right.
They've always been so proud of their immigration system and the fact that Canadians have been so supportive of newcomers.
Yeah.
But this recent backlash suggests that even in a country with a strong pro-immigration stance like Canada, there are limits to how much.
Could they have maybe found a better balance between those ambitious immigration targets and investments in things like affordable housing infrastructure, social services, all of that?
That's a really good question.
Mhm.
It's easy to look back with hindsight, but I do think there are some valuable lessons here.
Right.
Maybe a more gradual approach to increasing immigration levels combined with some really proactive measures to deal with that housing shortage and strengthen those social support systems,
Yeah.
that might have softened the blow a bit.
Yeah, it's kind of like they were trying to build a skyscraper on a foundation meant for a two-story house.
That's a great analogy.
At some point, the structure just can't handle that much weight.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Canada's immigration situation, I'm honestly left with this mix of concern and hope. They've admitted they need to make some changes, but the path forward isn't going to be easy.
Hmm.
What are your final thoughts on all of this?
I think it's important to remember that this isn't just a Canadian problem.
Right.
Countries all around the world are dealing with similar challenges. Yeah.
Immigration, economic inequality,
Yeah.
social cohesion, all of these things are interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Canada's experience is a really valuable case study,
Okay.
a real-world example of what can happen when all these forces collide.
Right.
The big takeaway for me is that we need to think about immigration policy in a much more holistic way.
Yeah.
We can't just focus on the economic benefits.
Mm-hmm.
We also need to consider the social and infrastructural needs of the country.
And just as importantly, we need to listen to the people who are actually living through these changes.
Absolutely.
The ones who are feeling the squeeze of rising costs, who are struggling to find a decent place to live, who are worried that their country is changing too quickly.
Right. Their voices need to be heard.
It's a complex issue, no doubt about it. But by really understanding all the different angles and learning from what's happened in other places like Canada, maybe we can find a way forward that works for everyone.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us and for bringing us such interesting and thought-provoking material.
My pleasure.
We hope you learned something new about Canada's immigration challenges and maybe even some broader lessons about the global issues we're all facing. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning.